There's a detail about the Great Sphinx that most people never hear. It wasn't built. Not really. It was left behind. Roughly 4,500 years ago on the Giza plateau. Ancient Egyptians weren't stacking blocks to create this monument. They were removing everything that wasn't it. The Sphinx is carved from a single ridge of bedrock limestone that was already sitting there. A leftover outcrop in the quarry being used to build the pyramids next door. Workers didn't build up. They cut down and around, chiseling away a horseshoe-shaped pit, and leaving one enormous shape standing in the middle. A lion's body, a human head, staring east. And the story of how they pulled that off is stranger, harder, and more mysterious than they carved a statue. Most scholars connect the Sphinx to the pharaoh Khafre, who ruled Egypt around 2558 to 2532 BC, though a minority of researchers argue it may date slightly earlier to his father Khufu. What's not disputed is the scale. The finished figure stretches 240 feet long and stands 66 feet high, nearly the length of a football field, with a head as tall as a 6-story building. To shape that out of solid rock, workers didn't have iron. They didn't have steel. What they had was copper. Soft, almost fragile by comparison, hammered into chisels, along with dolerite pounding stones hard enough to batter the limestone into rough form. Where the rock resisted, they're believed to have driven wooden wedges into natural cracks and soaked them with water, letting the wood swell and split the stone along the grain. Slow, physical, and unforgiving work, repeated for years. And here's where the project gets genuinely strange. The limestone at Giza isn't uniform. It sits in layers of different hardness. Some soft enough to crumble under a fingernail. Others dense enough to survive millennia. Whoever planned the Sphinx had to work with the rock they were given, which meant a statue whose body, carved through weaker layers, was already vulnerable to erosion the moment the tools stopped. The Sphinx wasn't just built. It was gambled on stone that was, in places, working against its own survival from day one. Researchers estimate it may have taken around 100 workers roughly 3 years to bring the statue to its current form. Though that number is an estimate, not a certainty, since no construction records for the Sphinx itself have survived. Which brings us to the part of this story that Hollywood got wrong for decades. For a long time, popular imagination pictured the Sphinx, like the pyramids beside it, as the product of whipped, enslaved labor. That image comes largely from the Greek historian Herodotus, writing 2,000 years after the fact, and it was cemented by films that needed a villain and a victim. But when archaeologists Zahi Hawass and Mark Leaner excavated a workers' cemetery and settlement just southeast of the Sphinx, what they found didn't match the myth. The burial shafts held workers laid to rest with bread and beer for the afterlife, buried close enough to their king's monument that, as Hawass put it, slaves would never have been allowed that honor. Evidence suggests laborers were rotated in shifts, drawn from farming communities across Egypt, fed on rationed cattle and sheep, and treated as a workforce worth commemorating, not property to be discarded. That doesn't mean the work was gentle. It was grinding, physical labor in open desert heat, done with hand tools against solid rock. For years, by people whose names we will never know. They just weren't slaves. They were something almost more unsettling in its ordinariness. Free people who spent their lives, and in some cases, gave their lives, carving a king's face into a mountain, for a wage, a meal, and a promise of the afterlife. And then, before the project was finished, they stopped. This is the part that even trained archaeologists still argue about. The temple built directly in front of the Sphinx, meant to complete the monument as a working religious site, was never finished. Some of its granite casing stones were left unset. Tool marks on parts of the structure simply end mid-task, as if workers set down their chisels and walked away. No inscriptions from the builders explain why. No scribe of the period even mentions the Sphinx by name. The most widely accepted explanation ties the timing to Khafre's death, around 2532 BC, when royal resources and priority likely shifted to the next pharaoh's own monuments, leaving Khafre's unfinished additions permanently incomplete. But that's still an inference, not a confirmed fact. Nobody alive can say for certain why humanity's largest hand-carved statue was abandoned an arm's length from completion. What we do know is what happened next. The Sphinx sat exposed to wind and drifting sand for centuries, gradually swallowed up to its shoulders. Forgotten enough that a later pharaoh, Thutmose IV, claimed the statue came to him in a dream and demanded to be dug out, in exchange for making him king. There's something almost too fitting about that ending. A monument built to project a pharaoh's eternal, unshakable power, spent most of its existence half-built, buried, and nameless. rescued from the sand not by the workers who carved it, but by the myth it eventually became. The people who actually built the Sphinx, stone by stone, over years of their working lives. Left no names behind it all. We know how they lived. We know how they worked. We still don't fully know why they stopped.